Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast with special guest, Father Jimmy Morgan. Woo!
Hello. Sorry I wasn't as excited in intro as you, Clark, but I am excited.
All right, this is a special episode called Stirring the Pot with Father Jimmy Morgan. Father Jimmy, can you tell us, you've had an interesting path to priesthood and you've been at Simple House before. Can you kind of share that with the audience, and then we'll get into all the most controversial issues facing?
Yeah, sounds good. So I was born and raised Catholic, went through all my sacraments, but was, I'd say probably a pretty average parishioner, went to Mass most Sundays, but if we went to a Protestant wedding on Saturday, that would have been church for the weekend. That was kind of our family's MO. But I remained Catholic. I started to kind of drift from the faith in high school, especially after my grandmother passed away, kind of that struggle of why would I follow a God who wouldn't save someone I love? That was part of the struggle. But then I went to Mount St. Mary's University for college, not because they're Catholic, but because they were giving me money. And then even after they gave me the initial scholarship, they offered me a better one. They just kind of called my house and they said, we want to give you this scholarship that will cover all of your tuition. And you just have to keep a certain GPA, and that's it. So I was like,
well, I think it's interesting what this qualification for your scholarship was.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And so there's a family, the Knott Foundation. They give a full tuition scholarship to a Catholic student from the state of Maryland who's going to a Catholic university in Maryland. So I fit those qualifications. And of course, when they called, my dad answered the phone and they're like, he's Catholic, right? My dad was like, oh yeah, he's a great Catholic boy, best I know. So that was really it. And I had actually had a teacher in high school who had gotten that same scholarship and told me to apply. And I initially said, I'm not going to apply for this. I'm not going to get it. I wasn't really involved in the faith, so I didn't see why I would get it. But I guess they thought I was the best candidate that year. So then going through college, getting involved in community service, getting involved in studying abroad, a variety of different things, I got to a point where I realized I needed to make a decision about what I believed in. I didn't quite know what was out there, but I knew I didn't kind of just want to be wishy-washy. I wanted to make a decision. And so I told the Lord, I said, all right, Jesus, you paid for me to go to college, and I didn't ask you to, so I'll give you the first crack at this, but if it doesn't work out, I'm moving on. I'm done. I'm going to be a Buddhist or whatever. And I was just about to give Jesus the final shot at being the God that I follow. And then sort of out of my control, I was invited to go on a retreat through our campus ministries because I was a student leader with community service. And on the retreat, confession was being offered, and it was probably one of my first real confessions. Like previously, confession was, I did this wrong this many times, that wrong these other many times, and that was it. But this time it was more of, I don't agree with the church on these things. I struggle to understand this. I, have all these sins in my life that I don't think the church wants me. And just talked out all those things with the priest. And he just kind of reassured me of God's love. And he told me for my penance to pray for Jesus to reveal himself to me. And that kind of blew my mind because I was always kind of like, oh, penance is no matter what you do, you say 3 Hail Marys and you move on and you're done. And honestly, there is something that can be good about that, but this shift was helpful. And I really think God showed up while I was doing that penance. And so that caused me to grow deeper and deeper in my faith because it brought great healing to, like I mentioned, losing my grandmother, great healing and all the struggles I had, and really drew me closer to the Lord. So then that started to grow deeper, and I did start to think about the priesthood at that point, but it didn't really sink in. So right after college, I wound up doing, the year after college, I was with an organization called Net Ministries, where they send out teams of young adults to do retreat ministry for high school and middle school students. Now they have a couple of other variations where they also stay at one parish instead of traveling to form a youth ministry program instead of just doing traveling retreat ministry. And that year was really good. One thing that really kind of changed my perspective was that in the beginning of training, they kind of said, yes, we want you to be good at giving retreats, but if you're the best giver of talks, you're the most sensitive small group leader, you're the funniest in skits, but you don't go to heaven, then we failed. And so their point was like, we want the goal of the people in charge of Net Ministries was to see us get to heaven. And I was like, man, I was hoping to just like travel the country, meet some cool people, go back to my life. But that sort of giving my whole life to the Lord in such kind of a radical way really kind of set me on that path. So then I took a year off. I helped care for my grandfather while he was living with dementia. And then when he needed more care than I could give, I decided to join Net's Canadian branch because I had never been to Canada before. That was sort of the main reason I called them. I was like, I liked Net. I had a good experience with them. And I've never been to Canada, so I gave them a call. So I lived up in Canada for 2 years. And while I was up there is when I really took the priesthood serious. I had dated a girl for a little while, and it went very well. But I just wasn't really satisfied in the relationship. And not even that things got bad. Things just got mediocre. And I was kind of like, I think the Lord has something else in store. And so then after that relationship ended in prayer, I was like, all right, Lord, what's going on? I thought this is what you wanted. Like there's people that are holier than me, wiser than me, that also thought this, but this is clearly not what you had in mind. And so I realized since that reversion in college, coming back to the faith, the priesthood had always been an option. My thoughts were always, if I go on a date and it doesn't work out, I can be a priest. If I get this job and I don't like it, I can always go to seminary. So I decided to make seminary the first choice. And I had initially contacted Baltimore, because that's where I grew up. And I had been out of the diocese for a little bit. There were some areas where they wanted me to grow. And so they invited me to come back to the area. And they are the ones that connected me with a Simple House. So while I was discerning is when I was at a Simple House. And I know a Simple House isn't designed as a discernment program, but when you're disconnected from the world and you're praying every day and you're going to mass and you're giving of yourself, it's kind of hard, like, not to hear the voice of the Lord, in that sense. And then, there was a shift because I completed the application process in Baltimore, but they didn't accept me. They didn't think I was kind of a good fit for them. And luckily, there were some good priests in my life who were kind of like, we don't agree with this. And they connected me with the Archdiocese of Washington. So through them, go ahead.
I thought it was really interesting that you kept at it even after getting turned down, Mm-hmm. But like, did they give you a reason when you got turned down? Or I don't know if that's too personal or not, but like, mm-hmm. How does that work?
Yeah. So they did give me a bit of a reason. They said there was, some things from my past that I hadn't fully worked through. Like they thought there was some sort of past experiences that I needed kind of more clarity on, if that makes sense, in order to, continue in the priesthood. Like the seminary formation is not intended to be the place for you to work through past experiences. It happens, but that's not its goal and its purpose. And so that was the reasoning they gave. And when I talked it out with my spiritual director at the time, who was a priest for the Archdiocese of Washington and involved in vocations, he was like, yeah, I don't agree. He was like, sure, you've got stuff to work through. We all do. But he didn't think I was at a point that I shouldn't have been accepted to seminary. So when I kept at it with the Archdiocese of Washington, I was able to clarify a lot of things. It kind of came out there was some assumptions that Baltimore made about me that weren't true, and they didn't take the time to clarify. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus or anything, but I think there wasn't a time that they kind of asked me certain things directly that I think would have clarified their concerns. But I was able to do that in Washington, and so then I became a seminarian for the Archdiocese of Washington. I did my theology studies at the North American College in Rome. Lived there for 5 years, and then now I'm a parochial vicar at a parish over in Montgomery County.
Now, I've met multiple guys who went to the NAC or the North American College, and it seems to be like extremely bright, meaning like very intelligent place, right? How did you find it? I've heard like historically that like it's a place that maybe is really smart, but maybe doesn't have the best moral formation. But then lately, I heard a guy who was there during COVID, and he said there were so many guys from North and South Dakota there that like when they had to shut down during COVID, they started their own basketball tournament, and it was the World versus Mega Dakota.
Yes, I was there for that, unfortunately.
Oh, you were there for that?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, good. All right. I don't think I heard that story from you, though. I think I heard that story from a guy from Oklahoma. Okay. But all right, so you know about Mega Dakota. Which
yes.
made me think the moral formation has to be okay if Rome is being populated by guys from North and South Dakota.
Yeah. So I just want to point out and say there are some Dakotans and Midwesterns, but the past few years, the Archdiocese of Washington has comprised sometimes up to 10, 11, 12% of the seminary. So our morals are overcoming the Midwest.
Well, that's not necessarily good.
There was often really funny kind of cultural interactions there because, us guys from the East Coast were like ragging on each other, can be pretty sarcastic, and some of the guys from the Dakotas or other Midwest states were kind of like a little thrown off. They weren't quite used to that kind of banter. They got used to it. But so...
But who won the basketball game?
Unfortunately, Mega Dakota won. But they had like 2 good players, and that was it. And they benched everyone else. And
you guys were beaten by 2 guys from Dakota. That makes it worse.
It does.
2 guys from Dakota beat the world.
Yeah. I didn't play. I'm not very good at basketball. We had a basketball tournament every year that was sort of like the different hall or floor you were on to put a team together. And I think I played 3 or 4 of my 5 years there. And I think I made maybe 3 baskets the whole time. So...
You guys have a soccer field there, too.
We have a soccer field that's also lined to be a softball field, and we have a track.
Can you help me understand that? Because I have this idea that the NAC must be very close to the Vatican, and I can't imagine that part of town in Rome having enough space for a soccer field.
Yeah, so the North American College, it's up the Janiculum Hill from the Vatican. Okay. So if you've been at St. Peter's and there's like a parking garage next to it, we're on the other side of that parking garage up the hill. And so in that space, we actually do have enough space for a track. It's a little smaller than your typical track. I think it's maybe 5 times around for a mile instead of 4. But there's a soccer field in the middle.
It's pretty spectacular.
Oh no, it is. It is very much so. And
it is close to the Vatican and amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so now you are a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington.
Correct. Now I'm here. That's the bones of my story, and we can dig into any parts or any other topics that your heart desires.
Well, how about we go to one of the things that you are a listener of the podcast. Is that right?
Yes, I am.
All right. You have some. I thought. How did we cover Star Wars in the past? Because you gave us feedback on Star Wars.
One of the times I was giving feedback was that you were talking about balance. You're talking about these sort of cultural concepts of balance, and the debates on the balance and the Force are ripe in the Star Wars community. So of course I think I texted Laura and I was like, how are you going to have a talk about balance and not mention the Force, and then, selfishly said, not have me on to talk about it.
Can you talk about the Force so I kind of understand, forgive me, audience, the theology of the Force for a second? So I know there's like the Sith Lords and there's the Jedi Knights, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, so if the Jedi Knights get really, really good, like they're really strong, does that mean there will be more Sith Lords to like counterbalance it? Or like what are they saying about balance in the Force?
Yeah, so there's some things about balance of the Force that are the light side and the dark side. And a lot of that actually draws a lot from different Eastern philosophies and Eastern spiritualities that show this kind of dual nature. And the Jedi and the Sith are just kind of two ways to express this. The Sith, because they're more worldly, more about their own preservation and longevity, they have what's called the rule of two, where there's just a Sith Lord and his apprentice. And you kind of go into that knowing that you're either going to keep being strong enough to basically always dominate your apprentice, and that apprentice is going to die, or your apprentice is going to become stronger than you and kill you and take over. So it's a lot about the sort of worldly sense of longevity and honor, where the Jedi have a bit more of a sense of becoming one with the Force. And so in some of the movies and the TV shows, certain Jedi that have almost achieved, so to speak, like sainthood in the Star Wars realm they become one with the Force, and so they show up later as a Force ghost. Whereas for the Sith, there's like no reason for that. They don't want anything beyond their life on Earth.
So I think this was kind of a powerful force in American culture. I'm old enough that I saw the first, episode 4, which was the first one made, at the Dollar Theater. I think it was in the Dollar Theater well into the 80s. And I remember being taken there by we thought it was the best to go to the Dollar Theater and go watch that, And I remember having the bones of Christian theology at that point, but being very persuaded by this force idea, And I don't think, and like I knew a kid growing up who was on my soccer team who would close his eyes during throw-ins because he would try to use the Force. And we can laugh at him, but I think there was a lot of kids closing their eyes trying to move objects in their room at that point. You know?
I mean, I laugh because that kid was me.
Right. Okay, great.
It's laughter of good memories.
Right. And I think though that there was a point in my undergrad when I had kind of started taking Catholicism seriously and having a conversion that the big era of the 90s was kind of a Unitarian era, that there was no difference between any other religions, et cetera, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember kind of like standing up to that, and then they were kind of trying to show me the good points of Hinduism, and I'm like, oh no, I think if I wasn't Catholic and I just was given no instruction, I might be Hindu, because I thought of that as basically, that's Star Wars. That's it just seemed like the Force in Hinduism, I don't know if they have Sith Lords in Hinduism, but this idea of becoming one with that energy that's animating everything, I felt that doesn't, in a way, we believe that energy that animates everything is real and it's a person. It's just not like a nameless, faceless energy. It's not something that you just become one with and lose your identity. It's something that you become, in a sense, in harmony with and keep your identity. Am I wrong in anything I'm saying right now, guys? But I thought that shoot, if I wasn't given all this, if I wasn't so convicted by Jesus and knowing God, I'd probably just, I'd probably feel you just go out in nature and you feel God, and that sounds like Hinduism a lot. Boy, I feel like I just outed myself in a bad way on that, but go ahead, guys.
No, I think that that gets to something very real and connected to Star Wars as well with the Force. And I do think sort of the big difference, though, like you brought up, Clark, was that in Christianity and Catholicism, we have a personal Force, so to speak. We have Jesus Christ. We have that personal relationship. Whereas Star Wars does talk about sort of the will of the Force, that there is sort of a will behind it. It's not quite just this completely impersonal connection of all living beings, but there's a will. But I do think there's a kind of lacking that relationship, which there's an interesting thing right now in some of the different movies and TV shows that Star Wars is coming out with, where they're kind of bringing up these issues with the Jedi and relationships, the Jedi and attachments, because Jedi are celibate. And there's been more and more stories of like, well, they're celibate, but the downfall happened because they couldn't have relationships. And I think if you are celibate just to be celibate, like, yeah, that's probably going to have problems. But like my celibacy is rooted in my relationship with Christ. And so there is a very real relationship there. And so...
Wasn't Darth Vader not celibate?
Correct. So. And so they point to that, like...
That's why he became Sith.
Yes, to try to save his wife, you know, and he couldn't do it on his own. And so he wanted the power to prevent people from dying. And his, like, being consumed by that power actually leads him to almost killing his wife.
All right, we're kind of off because...
Sure, yeah.
and the reason why I say we're off is because the first 3 movies that came out portray this idea very differently than the later movies. Correct. And, like... They felt it was kind of like a change in the age. Like the first 3 movies that came out made it very mystical, made it very like Hinduism, made it like a nature religion, right? Mm-hmm. And then the later movies felt the need to scientifically define it. Mm-hmm. Like with the, what do they call it? The Metachlorians or something like that?
Yeah, Mediocre.
It had to be measurable. It had to have an explanation. Mm-hmm. And they killed it as a, in a sense, a religion. You know, they killed it as a spiritual phenomena and made it like a chemical phenomena almost, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that in a way, I don't know, in a way it's like, hey, I think there was an important, interesting concept in the original Star Wars movies that was actually a temptation even for the West, you know? Mm-hmm. And they kind of ruined that interesting concept. Mm-hmm. You know, do you see continuity? I don't see a lot of continuity between the way George Lucas originally set things up and then the way he took it 20 years later. Mm-hmm.
To me at least, and maybe this is me just filling in my own gaps for the story, but it seems to me that the kind of making it overly scientific kind of led to the downfall of the Jedi. Like they thought they could make the Force completely measurable through all of the science and they could control it. And it became too rigorous. And so, in a sense, we're seeing this heightened scientific view of the Force right before their collapse.
Wow, isn't there a parallel there with, like, Catholicism?
Yeah. Maybe.
You know, there was a 20th century idea of, like, the historical critical method and, like, somehow using, like, a secular wisdom on the religion that missed the point of religion.
Yes, no, that's very true. While we did get some good research out of the historical critical method that went into scriptures and the faith, it kind of stripped away the fact that there's something mystical, there's something we can't fully grasp about the faith. Like God's always more. And so, yes, it's helpful for us to study the history of the scriptures and how they're made, but that's just one piece. It's not the whole pie.
We've probably talked about this before, but my opinion is the historical critical method is in and of itself a very good thing. Mm-hmm. But I think it also destroyed Bible study by the end of the 20th century. And I'm not trying to overstate that. I mean, I think it destroyed the ability of people to access Scripture for the meat of Scripture.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. I encountered a lot of guys in my studies that wanted to do their higher degree in Scripture studies, which was coming from a very good place, but then they would get frustrated when it became all about learning Greek and learning Hebrew and learning Latin, and a lot of their papers were more compare the tense of this verb with that verb, and you kind of miss the greater sense of scriptures when you're just dialed in on those little pieces. And those little pieces are important, but a lot of the guys I was talking to, they more actually probably wanted to study dogma or study moral theology, but have it being rooted in Scripture, which it should be. But when you spend all of your time just trying to parse out the different tense of this one word that only appears 3 times, you can kind of lose, I think, the bigger picture.
I feel like it ended up with this idea, similar to what you're saying, losing the bigger picture, where it's like you had to understand the significance of this coin in biblical times to unlock this scripture passage. That there was like a kind of time in Bible studies where it was like that, or you had to be able to explain it sort of scientifically, and that's why in my youth I had the loaves and fishes being a story about sharing,
right.
Not about miracles.
That second point is the point where it went totally off the rails. The first point is, in a sense, a distraction, right? Like you can get overly footnotish on the historical nature.
Yeah, but you think you can't. I agree, it's a distraction, but I think for a while there was an air that it was like you couldn't really do a Bible study without that knowledge. And I think, like, when we started a Simple House, the idea that we could just open the Bible and have a Bible study was like kind of wild. Like people didn't understand. I mean, like people outside the ministry, like, oh, you're not using like a Bible study guide, that was like a.
Yeah, I actually think I think we've healed from this quite a bit, and I don't know that Pope Benedict caused the healing, but his books on the Jesus of Nazareth series to me are the absolute redemption of the historical critical method of like showing the right way to do it, but you're like focus in all the different ministries in the church now crack open the Bible and they're almost like, hey, why have humans for 10,000 years been sharing this line of text? Why did God particularly want you to read it? Find something in this that is almost a revelation to you now and super relevant. And the historical critical method just kind of, Catholics were not doing that in the late 20th century, It rarely, like the Protestants were having much healthier Bible studies than we were because we had corrupted it, And I also think part of the reason for corrupting it like this is you can't teach spirituality. Like I can't no one can give me on a platter a relationship with God or a deep insight and communion with God, right? If you could, that's what seminary should be, or that's what every Bible study, etc. but no one can kind of teach that. But what I can teach is a bunch of theories about a coin, or Latin or Greek in tenses, there's I think that seminaries are starting to have this interesting correction now where they're having this it used to be called spirituality, or I don't remember what they're calling it now, but we're like Mundelein and everybody is like, hey, we're going to have a year with no grades. You're going to live in a house. We're going to read spiritual classics and we're going to just discuss and pray and have like a poverty immersion. That's a different take on formation than go to class, learn Greek, learn Latin, right? And they're kind of making more room for real spiritual insight and maturity there as opposed to like an academic rigor. But I don't know. You can't just, I don't know. What are we going to do? Like send guys to a seminary with a bunch of spiritual, very, wise monks and they're all going to sit at their feet and learn wisdom, or are we going to teach them Latin and Greek,
Yeah, I think there's a middle ground there. So the year you're talking about now, Clark, that's been instituted is they call it the propedeutic year. And so it's the first year of formation. You're not supposed to be taking academic classes. A lot of it involves a social media fast, a fast from cell phones. You do different retreats and different kind of, like you're saying, these immersion experiences. And that's supposed to be kind of the prep work before then getting into your more rigorous studies. So I didn't have to go through that. It was instituted as I was leaving. And so I don't know exactly how it's going. I've met some guys who've gone through it and they've had good experiences. I think sometimes, though, it can get a bit out of the realm of what diocesan priests are called to do. So some of these guys I've met that have had those kinds of years, and they developed really good community with those other men, and they did a poverty experience where they just sort of like, I'm going to go from my parish to a parish days away, and I'm just going to walk and hitchhike and knock on people's doors. There's some very good things there, but like none of that's the diocesan priesthood. You know, it's sort of like that's not what we do as diocesan priests. And I sometimes wonder if some of the guys that really like those sorts of things may actually be called to religious life. Some of these men that really get a lot out of the propedeutic year because they're disconnected from the world and they have more time to pray and study. Maybe they're called to be a Benedictine or a Carthusian. You know, some of these guys that really were like enlivened by the poverty experience, maybe they're called to be a Franciscan.
Do you think, in practice, do you think that's happening? Is it... Do you know that you know of?
I do know of a couple guys, and it's anecdotal, so I don't know how strong it is, but a few guys who, in the middle of seminary, have gone from diocesan formation to religious life. And I know some on the other side, too. Some guys, we just ordained at least 1 or 2 priests for Washington that had started with the Dominicans and kind of realized that they are called more to the diocesan life.
Can we talk about this big picture? And I don't hear anyone talk about this really. So I think we're as qualified as anyone to broach the subject. But like really big picture, we have for years now, if not a century or something, been like really educating our priests. Like you're going to know a lot of philosophy, you're going to know a lot of theology, you're going to be in school for a long time, right? And you're also going to need to know the basics of, just saying, giving them, doing the sacraments, right? And to me, that's kind of more or less the education, right? And what I think the priesthood is at this other level, though, is like pastoring. It's spiritual wisdom. It's you need to be deep in your own faith, right? And none of that formation, the philosophy, the theology, necessarily makes you deep in your own faith and grows you in relationship with God. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It could have a very good purpose. I mean, I think the world's very confusing right now, and having very philosophically and theologically educated priests is probably a good thing. It hasn't always been the way. I don't think priests in the 10th century got that. So I felt like this spirituality year is an attempt to give some spiritual, like the problem with spirituality is like when I say spirituality, I mean like just loving God, being in a relationship with God. The problem with that is it can't be taught, it can't be handed. You can't have a classroom, you can't have a test at the end of the semester, right? Although people have tried. Like if you look up spiritual theology books that were particularly popular right before Vatican II, they tried to do that, So we're giving these guys like essentially a year-long retreat, as a formation experience. I could justify subtracting 1 year of theology and philosophy and just adding a year-long retreat in there as like making sense, I guess I'm saying like there's I felt like what you were saying, Father Jimmy, is that there's like a professional there's a professional issue with priests where you just have to know your stuff, and the spirituality year is not doing that, but if it's helping them become better pastors because they just have worked on their spirituality for a year and have better self-knowledge of themselves and stuff, then it's really helped them become great priests, I think.
I think I do think the spirituality year is helpful in the long run. I agree with you, though, that I think it would have been better to subtract a year of the academics and replace that with the spiritual year or the propedeutic year, as opposed to adding another year on, because the current program for priestly formation adds this year in the beginning and then adds what they call a synthesis year or 6 months at the end. So then as a deacon, before you're a priest, you're supposed to spend at least 6 months in a parish when you're finished your academics. And so it kind of adds at least a year and a half to the formation process that was already usually on average 7 years. So now it's probably averaging 7-8 years. And I think it should have been like shorter and more intense, you know? And so the spirituality year does help. And yeah, and we do need good holy pastors that have a good spiritual life. And a lot of the academics we have can lead to that, but we have they call them formation evenings, formation nights, where we get a talk from a priest on how to do parish finances, how to run an RCIA or OCIA as it's called now. So we get some of that practical stuff as well. And I'm glad that those aren't always coming directly from the academic world, so that it's not just about passing a test at the end. Some of my classes, the professors would say, oh, you need to know this for the test. You need to know this for the exam. You need to know this for the exam. And it was a really kind of great moment, because studying in Rome, you study with priests and religious and lay people from all over the world. And as this professor is talking about needing to know these things for the final exam, one of the guys from Africa, whose life is very different than mine, raised his hand with the same sentiment. We're not here to pass a test. We're here to become good priests. And so, yes, we know we need to pass a test, but it's not just about that. And so it's a great moment to kind of realize that, like, my life is very different from a priest in Nigeria, but we both are very similar in the fact that we want to be good holy priests. And just passing a test is not the barometer for that.
What are other barometers apart from because the whole time you're in seminary, there's like a mutual discernment, like from the diocese and from you, like, am I still called to this? And it's like you can't be slacking off in your spiritual life at the seminary and expect to get through, is what I understand. Is that
correct? So every man has a spiritual director and a formation advisor, and there's these, I don't know if you've talked about it on the podcast, but the sense of internal forum and external forum. And so, like, what I would have told my spiritual director basically just remains between him and I. He doesn't have a vote in my advancement. What I tell my formation advisor, while it's in confidence, he's not going to go tell all the other seminarians. It could come up in my vote to advance in formation. So keeping an open, honest relationship with the two of them is another one of these kind of good barometers. And then, you know, there's other priests that are on faculty. You do kind of reviews. Like, we all had to review each other pretty much, give evaluations. So those are some of the other kind of points.
Did you feel like that you saw men kind of, in a sense, like taken out of formation or not passed up to the next level who should have been?
I did not. I don't think I saw anyone who was taken out that should have stayed in. Pretty much everyone who was taken out, I agreed with that decision. There's a couple of people that maybe I didn't know them as well, that I was sometimes surprised when they moved forwards in formation. Some of them have already left the priesthood, not from my class, but, you know, there was a guy, kind of infamous story. He was a few years ahead of me, not from my diocese, different diocese. And at I think his priesthood or diaconate reception, he's given a little thank you speech and was like, you know, I'm going to give it a good shot, but if this doesn't work out, I can always move on. Ooh. And everyone there was like, what did we just do? You know? And wow. Yeah, he's gone already.
Okay.
So Ryan and I went to Jimmy's Father Jimmy's diaconate ordination in Rome, and one of your classmates, like at the 11th hour, discerned that he was not going to continue on, and his like whole family had come from the U.S. To Italy. And I just was like so happy for that guy, and that there was that freedom, you know, and for him, you know, both from his family and from the seminary and all around, to say, I'm not going to go through with this, even though I have prepped for this like every step along the way to get here, and my whole family isn't from out of town. It was pretty wild. Is that?
Yes, I also very much admired his courage to stand up and say, "I'm not ready." He's now a priest.
Oh, he is.
So
okay.
he continued. He kind of went a bit more the route of doing a pastoral couple of years.
So there's all these stories about like legendary old football training camps where like they wake up the next day and the quarterback like snuck out at the middle of the night to leave camp and to never come back, you know? Did that happen at seminary where like one time some guy just like you wake up and he's like, he's gone. Like he ran. Like
it didn't happen to me, but I know some guys that's happened to where the guy was gone. There was also kind of a funny story from my time at the John Paul II Seminary in DC, where if you like didn't clean your room, didn't show up to mass on time, a couple different things, you got put on what was called morning list, where you had to be ready for the day an hour early, and the vice rector would come to your room and check. And there's an infamous story where one of these guys got put on morning list, and in the middle of the night, him and his buddies cleared out his room as a prank and left a note that was like, "I'm really sorry I couldn't live up to your standards," you know. And so the vice rector came and like found this and started to like have this real crisis. And then the guy like popped out and was like, "Just kidding," you know. And he had to have a talk on that pranks can be good, but maybe not that prank.
I feel like he's already in trouble and then he does that. That's wild.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. Because there's other stories of guys who like turned their room into a crime scene when the vice rector came, or just kind of, I don't know, other kind of goofy stuff, but not pretending that they up and left in the middle of the night because they let the vice rector down.
Right. All right. So Laura and I are big advocates for mediocre priests. We love mediocre priests. The main reason to love mediocre priests is because people like to complain about them all the time, and you have to be like, come on, people. You know? All right. So when I hear people complain about priests, I realize that there's like three big parts of the priestly job in the American church. And this is not a theological idea. This is just a practical idea, right? They have to do the sacraments. They have to actually just run mass and hear confessions and do those things. In an ideal way, people complain if they're not great, like interpersonal pastors, you know, if they're not helpful and, you know, you don't relate with them well and they aren't able to give great spiritual advice and say all the right things. And then there's also this idea that each church is kind of I don't want to call it a business, but there's a lot of accounting, there's a lot of management, there's a lot of staff, there's a lot of like, you know, just management aspect of being a priest. And so like, it seems rare when you meet a guy who's a priest who's like on top of all three aspects, like huge spiritual insight, great interpersonally, great with all the sacraments, and managing the parish like a great little institution, you know, including sometimes a whole school, you know, attached to the parish, right? And I've often thought that seems like a big ask to find guys who are good at all three of those things. And one of them you can't divorce from the priesthood, which is the sacramental part, right? But I feel like almost we could like, this is a conversation I've been wanting to have with like a bishop, is to say, look, why don't you sit your guys down, do an aptitude test, or just give them a review of what they're good at and what they're not good at. And then if they're not good at the like management part, hire a lay person to do the management part. Or if they're not good at the like spending time with people, you know, interpersonal part, then hire a lay person to do that part, you know? In a sense to find a complementary lay person to go with the priest so that the whole institution functions better. Does that sound crazy, or what are your thoughts?
Do you mean go with a priest?
Well, like let's say
assignment?
It could be like, why not? You know, but like it needs to not be a permanent job. It's not like a vocation in that way, you know, but it should be like, okay, you priest, you've never been that good at the business management part. So here's a sample outline of a position to help you run the parish and school. And we're going to interview people and then find one you like, you know, and put them on a 2-year contract. And at the end of 2 years, we'll interview again, and they could get it again or not. But I'm really against these people who become lifetime little, fiefdoms in the church. I mean, priests are allowed to do that, but lay people should not be doing that, where they're like entitled to this position in the church. That's bad, right? But it does seem like it's a lot. I mean, like in my own parish, we have a school. We have a lot of ministries. We've got Boy Scouts, everything coming out of this. There's men's groups, there's women's groups, there's Christ Renews' parish, there's the actual mass, There's all this stuff going on at this church and weddings and all this stuff. And for one guy to just be on top of it for decades, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of guys who can do that well.
Yeah, I think that's a big ask to have a priest do all of those things. Partially, it leads to us relying on the sacrament. Like it's a sacrament why I'm a priest, not because of my particular aptitudes or skill set. Yes, the two kind of can go together, but there is a grace in the sacrament, and there's the Holy Spirit working in our churches that allow this to happen. Now, there's a practical side as well, and I know different dioceses will have the bishop knows which priest is good at finances, and he'll go to a parish, and it maybe sometimes works better to his advantage that he's not as pastoral or as personal, because he goes to the parish and he closes the convent because they can't actually afford the sisters there. He fires whoever and rights the ship financially, and then the diocese gets rid of him, and the pastor who's got the good personal touch comes in to bring the healing, in a sense. Not that the diocese ever wants to cause these wounds by closing things down, but they do recognize that sometimes difficult decisions need to be made, and sometimes with the parishes, you can have one priest come in to make those decisions and then have him move on and bring in another priest to kind of bring about the personal healing and renewal afterwards.
That sounds like such a bad system, Father Jimmy. Because like say we identified you and said, hey, look, Father Jimmy, we need another good priest to work the guillotine. So can you sharpen your ability to fire people? And this is going to be your priesthood. We're going to move you into troubled parishes to clean them up. I mean, that's just not.
No, and sorry, Laura, go ahead. Were you about to?
No, I mean, there are priests that definitely seem to have that trajectory.
Yeah.
As their...
I know, but like, it's almost unfair to them. It's like when a bishop, there have been bishops who have this issue too. There's been bishops who've assigned a diocese who immediately have to close like 12 parishes, right? And it's not their fault. It's that the last guy refused to close any parishes. And so now all this horrible stuff's happening at once, when really good management, it would have never come to this like big bloodbath. Yeah. And it's not fair to that bishop. Everyone hates that guy.
And I think, yes, it's not fair to that guy. I don't think it would be fair to a priest to have that be kind of his MO as he goes about the diocese. And it's not a good system, but we also find ourselves in a transition time in the church, and maybe the church is constantly in transition, but we don't have the same numbers of Sunday mass going parishioners that we used to. And so there is need to close churches. Like, the ideal would be no parish needs to close. And so that doesn't ever need to happen. And the priest can just go and run it. And all of the parishioners are there all the time. And they're giving their finances. And if someone's really good at plumbing, they donate their time to fix the toilets. Like, ideally, like in an ideal world, all this comes together. And so these kind of decisions don't need to be made. But we find ourselves in not just a decline in numbers in the Catholic Church, but in most organized religions, people are finding that their numbers are going down, at least here in the United States. And so their parishes and dioceses are finding themselves in a point where they have to make tough decisions.
Well, I think we wandered off the topic a little bit. We do know there's tough decisions, and we know that certain people are better at it than others, right? And there's certain people who the whole reason why what religion's meant to them is be a nice person and things like this, right? And they find it particularly hard to do that type of work, right? what I'm kind of asking, I think, so since Vatican II, in a sense, we've had greater lay involvement in, I guess, management. It's almost always taken the form, as far as I can tell, this is very anecdotal in my life, it's always been a committee.
Mm-hmm.
I find that committees don't manage anything well. You know, like Ford Motor Company, there's no major company managed by committee.
Mm-hmm.
You know? I've seen it happen before where there's like a layperson hired to do things the priest is not good at, who kind of takes charge of it and does something really positive. You know? It seems like it's very important that that person's not a forever employee of the parish. It's important that that person compliments the priest. You know, and is actually enacting what the priest wants. You know, at some level, right? I just think I don't see management reform happening in a way that I think would really help everyone if it did. You know.
I know a priest that was starting a new initiative at his parish, and he needed to write a business plan, and that was not his skill set, but he took a stab at it, wrote a business plan, and then took it to a guy at his parish that he trusted, and he was like, this is horrible, and he wrote a business plan for him, and it was not for hire, you know, it was like a thing that he did for the parish, but like a committee couldn't have done that.
I don't think they could. Are you saying they could have?
No, I'm saying a committee could not do that.
Right.
And I think I don't know. I think these this isn't really a suggestion for big, wide reform, but it's like you have a plumber at the parish. Can he do some plumbing at the parish? You have a businessman who can write a business plan for the parish. And not every parish has those different, you know, sets of people. I don't know.
I think that committees, like let's pretend we're
a committee can't do plumbing or write a good business plan the way that an individual could.
Good point. And committees make certain types of mistakes. You know, they're usually slow moving. They have all these other mistakes. The role of a committee, like when you look at nature, and by nature I mean humanity, is there a check and balance against a manager, right? Like Ford Motor Company or all these companies have boards of directors. They don't manage. And it's very important that they don't manage. I think I see nonprofits get in trouble when the board of directors tries to manage the nonprofit. They appoint and fire managers. You know, like they're kind of like democracy. Like, you know, we elect someone to run things and then we can fire them as a group. So the group has this role, but actually management's not its role. You know, and when you try to push all your decisions through a committee and get them all to agree on your decisions, you're going to have very undynamic leadership, and things are going to sneak up on you because you move so slow, and problems are going to fester, you know. And you're going to have politics by definition, because anyone who can try to work the committee will do it, you know.
Yeah, I feel I'm not.
So it's like we need to,
but I think a good committee. So you're saying checks and balances, but also it could be breaking a big job into smaller parts, and there have to be like tangible things that are being done or not done, rather than it being like an ambiguous power group or something.
I don't think committees do that. I mean, you have to have a lot of people involved, but just not as a committee. Like if you have a manager, he has a lot of people involved. They each have their responsibility areas, or they each have their jobs and tasks, right? But committees are about making decisions and stamping decisions.
Okay.
And they're inherently not very good at it, and they have different problems that come up, you know, and they get very political. So it's like I'm all for more lay involvement that Vatican II kind of ushered in. I just think we went the wrong direction with committees, and we need like these
I don't know,
priest cooperators.
Right.
There is a diocese. I met a priest like a year or so ago, and their diocese is trying a program where, at least for the bigger parishes, like the priest is the CEO, and they have a lay person who's like the CFO, who does. So there are some parishes and dioceses who are trying that model, where you have a lay person who understands business and the business world and contracts, who can handle all of those things, so that the pastor is free to be the pastor, free to do the interpersonal side, do the sacramental side. He still is obviously very involved in these decisions when it comes to what to spend the money on, but he doesn't necessarily have to balance the budget, spend time on those sorts of things. And the day-to-day managing of all the finances, he's not as directly involved in.
I think that would be the smallest reform that would make sense. But I know of a parish where, the priest actually hired a pastoral person who's a lay person, right? And it's been really good for the parish because that wasn't where the priest was thriving. Well,
yeah, I was going to ask about that because I think in some Protestant churches it's like all personality and interpersonal, but I don't think it is that way in the Catholic Church, and we have room for pastors that aren't necessarily interpersonal all-stars.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's a balance that needs to happen. I know some very good priests that are well respected and loved by their parishioners, and they don't come across the fluffy teddy bear. They could be a little brash, but I think them authentically living their priesthood, and that the people know that the priest loves them, goes a long way. Even if that love isn't always expressed in them being able to listen the most kind of compassionately.
Let's switch subjects a little bit. So my undergrad experience was in the 90s, and it was kind of a hippie school. Like people, a lot of, people didn't bathe every day where I went to school, right? And I actually lived at a co-op that was founded in the 60s called the Sunflower House, and we had our fair share of hippies. But I was never really a hippie, and I never really kind of went in with it. And I didn't mind being around it, though. I kind of liked it. And but I knew guys who liked the Grateful Dead and then later Phish, and they would tell me that Phish is kind of like the new Dead. Is that true?
There's a lot of similar aspects there with the fan base. I'd say, yes, Grateful Dead kind of has a little bit of the original side of people following them, but there's a lot of similarities, and people will spend their whole summers, whole years just on tour following these bands. Both of them develop their own kind of internal economy amongst the people who travel with them. And so you got the guy who sells grilled cheese, and you got the guy who sells ponchos, and you got the guy who sells other things, and this economy, just like they're basically constantly sharing the same money, goods and services. It's kind of, that economy is kind of built by the people who just go to the show when they're in their own town and they don't tour with them.
So it's not that the people who go to Dead shows for a year are independently wealthy. They actually like participate in like the whole fare of the show, right?
You do have both. You do have people who are just independently wealthy and they can afford to do this. I'd say that's more the case now with the Grateful Dead, because their heyday was 70s, 60s, 70s, maybe into the 80s, with the height of them. And so now, if you were following them back then and then you have a career, you might have a decent amount of money at this point of your life,
Okay. So when this was always being pitched at me by my Sunflower House, friends, it was very idyllic. It was very, you wouldn't call it, it was religious, not in a Catholic way. It was very liberal, whatever. And it was beyond hippy dippy. I mean, it was full blown hippie, right? And now, this character, Tucker Carlson, who's interesting, apparently he's been to 100 Dead shows. You know, like that was a big part of his, high school, college, growing, and still he's a Deadhead, And you're not supposed to be a conservative commentator in a Deadhead, You're also not supposed to be a Catholic priest in a Deadhead. Can you help me understand like the synergy here? Because I think you know some Deadheads.
I do know some Deadheads. Some of them are other priests. Some of them are not religious at all. And so there is a mix. I think, for me at least, I can only really speak to myself. There's something outside of yourself with that community at large, where you come face to face with people from all walks of life, and you're united by this central thing, which is the music that you're following. And when it develops into this traveling community, like with the Grateful Dead or with Phish, or I don't know of any of the current bands that might have that same level of a following. You learn to live with these people that are from different walks of life, and you love each other, and you grow, and you become a community. And so I think, in a sense, that appeals to, I can't really speak for Tucker Carlson, but that sort of external locus of identity can be similar to the priesthood. Not in the sense that we're making our identity with the Grateful Dead, and that's why I'm a priest, but it's my identity is with Jesus Christ. So there's this external locus of who I am. I'm also an individual, but it goes beyond just me, and it gets to something bigger than that.
I had this observation in my 20s. I knew a couple different like artist communities, and it was like very beautiful because there's like the communal aspect to it. There's like the creative aspect, and there's like a kindness and sharing and all like really positive. And in a way I was like, well, this is like tapping into something of like how God wants us to live and like what's beautiful in the world. But in another way, I thought it was like a hindrance for some people because it was like almost the thing, and they were closer than other people to it, and maybe weren't seeing that they weren't missing like the real thing. I don't know. In my college and early 20s day, I thought there was this like FOMO aspect motivating like people that would go on tours, because there would always be like like, oh, you have to listen to this recording of Phish at this whatever. And so there was always like, were they going to go to the show with the best recording of this song ever that was going to be 20 minutes long? I don't know.
Yeah. I do think that's a very real aspect of following bands like Phish and the Grateful Dead, where they are really into the art form. They're into the music and the experimentation behind it. And they don't want to play the song the same way every night. They want to experiment with the music and kind of let the music kind of take them different places. And so, you do kind of miss out if you don't see them all. And so all of these bands are also very big on letting people come to their shows and record the shows and share the tapes with other people. That's how they got known, is someone would say, hey man, I made you a tape, or I burned you a CD of Phish at Red Rocks this year, and you listen to it, and they covered whatever, this Bruce Springsteen song, and it was awesome. And and so there is that sense of they don't want it to be the same every night, and so they want it to be different. So maybe there is some FOMO. Yeah.
What about, though, I wondered if it was kind of like jazz, where it was just kind of like this free jamming that kind of would like evolve, But like when I would listen to it, which I never went to a concert or anything, I'd be like, well, I'm not really getting a catchy tune. This is not going to be a big hit with me, And I also knew that a lot of people into it, maybe also similar to jazz, were often enhanced chemically when they were listening to it. And I almost wondered if that was necessary, like to really like it. Is that like
Apparently, no.
It's a prevalent part of those communities. I would say it's not necessary, but it is a prevalent aspect of it. I do find that while I've been to a few Phish concerts, I've seen various members of the Grateful Dead, I enjoy the live experience much more than the recorded experience. I think there is something about being there as it's being created, where, along with the other people, where it lends itself to this unique experience. Yeah. And
would you rather watch your favorite football team in an ideal living room with a TV or be at the game?
I think I'd personally be at the game, because the community is so much stronger. You do get a different sense of the game. I haven't been to too many live football games. I've been to a couple, but there's certain times on TV you're watching it and you're like, why did he throw the ball there? You just have no idea when you're watching on TV, because it's very clear that someone else was open and this guy's not. But I've been at games like in person and you're like, oh yeah, this guy definitely, I understand why he threw it to that receiver. He thought he was open. The play was developing that way. You couldn't tell this other guy was open. It was all the commentators on TV. I do think there's an aspect of the broadcast football game and sports events where they want to heighten the drama and the intrigue and the entertainment value. And so they kind of push different narratives that you don't always get when you're there in person.
Well, the stadium is like also full senses. Like they're gonna turn off the lights, they're gonna flash them. It's like crazy. The music is so loud. So I don't know. You have to.
Mm-hmm.
I asked this question because like I've been to concerts before that I didn't like the live music that much compared to the album. You know, because on the album it's about as good as they could get it in about as good a conditions as they could get it. You know, and I asked that about football because I do know a lot of people prefer to be at the game, but I actually feel like I get more out of it when I'm like watching on TV, you know, but I'm not getting the whole, like what Laura's saying, like the party with it, you know? So and it seems like the Dead, it's a lot of that, you know, but I have like two more topics to bring up with you guys. Father Jimmy, as a priest who's not yet a pastor, right? Do you have a lot of ideas of what you want to do when you're pastor? Like how you're going to like redecorate or fire a few people, change a few things, or, you know, like how's that work?
I do have some ideas. Redecorating is not my strong suit. I am very bad at that part of things. So luckily, I've met some people that are interior decorators that I know if I walk into a space and go, something's not working here, they can come in. But that is an interesting place to be as a parochial vicar, that I'm not the pastor. I am not at this parish very long. You know, my pastor gave great advice when I was throwing a bunch of ideas out there for different events or ministries, and he said, you can do whatever you want as long as it will survive after you leave. Like if I started something, he didn't want to be the one to finish it. And so that helped frame things very well. But there are definitely things where I think if I'm a pastor, would I do it this way? You know,
I guess, you know, one of the problems of lay people right now is we're all look around the church and think about how we would do it differently. But you're actually in a position where you're going to get to do it differently. So do you have like a big list or what?
It's honestly, it depends so much on the parish. I know that's not it's kind of a little bit of a non-answer, but having spent time in different parishes now, there is a sense of, you know, some of my friends their youth ministry programs are going really strong. And my youth ministry program's a little bit smaller. We're in this weird situation with quite a few of like our youth ministry, our young adult, where it's like just guys. There's like no high school girls that want to come, no like young adult women in our parish. And so like trying to figure out how to get these women to come is it's part of the unique problem. Like I'm encountering.
That's kind of
Are they
that's like of this
guys?
age.
Are they normal?
They're normal guys.
But like young men are far more conservative right now than young women. Like that's just like surveys out right now that like young men want nothing to do with the kind of great progressive causes, and so they're gravitating towards based stuff like the Catholic Church.
Yeah. I think for me, if I'm looking at specific programs that I would want to kind of build in a parish, which I can even do a little bit now, would be to like re-engage the people who are already there. We've kind of run into this issue that happened during the pandemic where lots of people saw their parish go to live stream, and the priest and maybe the couple people who helped out were able to run Mass just fine. And then when Mass reopened, they couldn't have servers or a choir or too many extra people helping. And so people got into a mindset of the church is surviving without me. I don't need to do the ministries I used to. I don't need to step up and be involved as much as I used to. And so kind of re-engaging people in that way, I think is something I would want to focus on moving forwards. Because I've run into this a couple of times where it's not my responsibility to make sure all the extraordinary ministers are present. There's someone else that's their responsibility when we're getting ready for Mass. And then when I'm getting the different ciborium together, no one's coming forward. No one's coming up. And I look around the congregation and I make eye contact with a few people who I know are trained ministers. And some of them come forward. Some of them don't. Some of them see that no one's coming forward, and they also choose not to fulfill this role that they could do.
As a priest, have you ever thought about like, do you ever give some hard corrections, or do you ever threaten people with hell?
I don't necessarily threaten people with hell. I have preached on that it's real. I preached that yes, Jesus was very loving and he did these great miracles of healing, but he also said sin no more. But
have you tried to scare them, or have you just said it's real? Like, have you ever used that as like, is that in your bag of like pastoral tools? I got to scare this guy that hell's real, or not? Like, scare this guy, he might go to hell.
I haven't used the scaring end of it. Maybe I'll work on that. I'm not a very
That's not a
scary
joke.
individual.
It's just kind of a funny. It's kind of an interesting idea, I mean, I think there's been people who've been helped by that.
Yeah, no, that's true. Giving hard corrections, I've maybe not too hard, partially because as my role as parochial vicar, my pastor is very good, and he said he's always been willing to take that on. And so he's kind of put me in a position where I don't have to really like lay the hammer. And
You're the good cop.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, so you do plan on giving hard corrections once you're the head cop. Police chief of the parish. But like, you don't go to that extraordinary minister at the back of Mass and be like, Jim, get over here.
Yeah.
I looked right at you.
Yeah.
Why didn't you get up here and help out? Don't play dumb, Jim. I know what you're doing.
Well, on one end, I'm not seeking that out, so I guess that's on me. But on the other end, the amount of people that just kind of rush by you at the end of Mass that you're trying to greet, and there's people that want to have long conversations, even though there's now a line of people. There's a lot of them, and so it's hard to take people aside and give those corrections in the moment with the reality of the end of Mass.
Well, it'd even be better if you just go to their house and knock on their door afterwards. I mean, this is just a pragmatic problem that can be solved.
True. Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't use email. I think it's got to be, look the guy in the eye,
No, I agree. I try to, another thing I've learned a lot from my pastor is he's like very opposed to email. We'll use it if we need to, but he's like, just call me. He's like, pick up the phone and call somebody. And I've had much more success calling people to ask them about things, to like I'll have the initial conversation about baptism prep and why they need to come to Mass and bring their kids to Mass. And then I can send them an email to find out when their kid was born. Like, I'll do the email for the logistics. I'll do the phone call and the in-person meeting for the more relational, catechetical parts of that.
I think there's a lot of young Catholics right now. I'm on the older side of the young Catholics, who maybe were raised in 2 or 3 child families, right? And they're getting fired up for the faith and openness to life and things like that. And they want to be Catholic. And they're also entering an economy that's not as friendly as, say, the economy that people raised large families in the 70s, you know? And I think it's getting harder to be Catholic. Meaning, like, if you got, let's say 5 kids is probably the smallest amount I'd call a big family. It's like a small, big family. So if you got like 5 kids, you're making the median income, you're living at your parish, you know, it's hard to get the books to balance quite right with that. You know what I mean? You kind of want to have a mom stay home when you have a lot of kids just because it's pretty helpful, even if you have no other big reason for it, you know? But I'm worried that there's a sorting happening, you know? I think the Jewish population's been through this many times over the centuries where it became very hard to be Jewish and a lot of people left and the really committed stayed, you know? And that's not a good thing, you know? Meaning, like, we want to be like inviting the divorcee into our church. We want to be inviting the people who've had problems in life into our church. But it feels like almost for factors outside of us, the ask is getting higher and higher, you know, to sit at the table, you know? So any thoughts on this, guys?
Yeah, I do think in many regards, there's this aspect you talked about with having a lot of kids, having a lot of children. And that is frequently part of the limiting factor, I guess, for people, because then there's definitely a pressure that can happen if a couple who's practicing natural family planning, doing everything in line with the church, but they don't want 6, 7 kids. There's almost gets to be this kind of tension where it's like, well, why don't you want to have more kids? And it's like, well, we can't manage them, you know?
Well, I'm thinking, like, you know, like the peers I grew up with or siblings or whatever, if you're from one of these 2-3 person family now trying to have these kids, it's like, you know, to fly my family anywhere is a few $1,000s one way. You know what I mean? Like, and you're going to start living a different life than the family who has 2 kids. You're going to be going on different vacations. You're going to be going, you know, and like when I look at Catholic school, like high school, I think the prices where I'm at are fairly cheap, but they're still $10,000 to $12,000 a year per child. So I'm going to need about $50,000 per child. You know, I don't think you can just walk up to a Catholic family with 5 kids and be like, okay, you better plan on having $250,000 during the high school years to just pay, you know, or even half that. I mean, that's a huge ask, right? It just seems like it's like we say, like, here's a set of expectations, and you're going to start. The people you normally thought of as your peer group are going to start separating from you dramatically if you live this way. And it's not even clear you can live this way because it's not clear you're going to have $250,000 to send your kids to Catholic school or whatever. So I'm just kind of, that's where I'm kind of, I don't think I proposed my problem well enough when I first proposed it, you know? And then there's some people who are all-stars who can, you know, who show that it is possible, but they're almost always exceptional people. And we need something where us average Catholics can make it, you know?
Yeah, I think it's also very dependent on the area that you're in. Like, I grew up in a 2-child house. I have 2 older sisters, but my oldest sister is 13 years older. So she was not really at home when I was a kid. And our vacations were always, we went to the beach for 1 week. And it actually wasn't until college that I realized people did other things on vacation. Like, me and my friends in school, we would always just ask, when are you going to the beach this summer? Maybe we'll be there at the same time. And this was a 2-child house. Whereas certain areas of the country and my own archdiocese, like, even families that have 4 or 5 kids, it's not an issue for them to fly their kids to Florida for the summer, to do numerous vacations. So again, it depends on the area. It depends on the area. It depends on kind of the competing lifestyles around them. I also am not sure if that gets to the heart of your question. I guess at one of the initial prompts of this question, Clark, you said like that it's hard to be Catholic. And I think one of the things that also makes it hard to be Catholic is the competing other social dynamics that are out there. Like in the past, if you wanted to be with people with similar mindsets and values, you went to your church. Like that's all that was out there. And so you kind of had built-in youth programs, built-in friend circles. Like you could go to the church for the picnic and your kids could run around and you didn't have to worry about babysitters because all the families were there. Whereas today you can online figure out the very specific sports group that you want your kids to be a part of. You can figure out this other group that has the same values. So you can figure out all these things without going directly to your home parish. And so that makes it harder to become Catholic because it used to be easy to find people like mindset. You just go to your parish and that's it.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying like it's never really that hard to be Catholic if all Catholic means is go to Sunday Mass, believe these beliefs, live a good life, right? But there's always something more than that on being Catholic. And what I mean by that is there's also these like social expectations and what it means to be in part of the group and what we identify as ideal. You know, like the young Catholics I meet think it's ideal to have a lot of kids, right? But maybe they don't even know what that takes. You know, and they also think either homeschool is ideal or this is ideal. Well, not everyone's cut out to homeschool. Not everyone can afford the Catholic schools anymore. It's just kind of a weird, I feel like we're proposing people into a life that's not just Catholic. It's actually a whole social expectation group that is very difficult.
There's a lot of discussion around like, you know, if you're going to have a big family as a mom, it's like, you know, there's just a lot of emotional and time demands. And I think people understand that more or less. It's still surprising when you get there. But I think you're saying there's these other costs and sacrifices that maybe we're not expecting, and it gets harder and harder.
Certainly, like as someone who came from a smaller family myself, like the amount of diaper changing I'm doing every day, the amount of hustling to get, 6 kids ready, in the morning, whole different thing than I ever saw.
Right. But that's like a reasonable person would imagine that.
Yeah,
right.
That
but
is
you
what
don't,
it is, right?
You don't necessarily imagine like, oh, I'm going to have a different standard of living than I did growing up.
Yes. Yes. And my neighbors will be going to Europe and I won't. And my neighbors will eat this and I'll eat lentils. Right. And like if you just take like a median income for like a 35-year-old, which is somebody who could easily have 5 kids, right? It's probably like $70K, right? And then you like take that and figure out how much of that just goes to a median house or even a less than median house. You know what I mean? And then how much of that's got to go to education and feeding that crew and health insurance and whatever, right? You just get quickly to a point where it's like, I don't think all these people signed up for this. But it's also going to be like the people who persevere in this are going to be very dedicated or very good at making money because that makes it easier, and therefore there's kind of I don't know. This is a very non-thought out idea. I'm just worried about it. I want to open wide the doors of the church, and I'm worried that we've created an environment where it's difficult to do. Like as our culture gets less kid friendly, it's just difficult to have a big family.
I mean, I think even this might vary geographically, but here I would say it's hard to have 2 kids and have kind of normal, like,
I agree.
Teacher and what, you know, like not, you have to be making the big bucks around here.
Right.
Yeah.
I think from my perspective, one of the things that I encounter with the difficulty of being Catholic, especially with a bit of a larger family, is when people will talk to me and they'll say, Father, I'm not praying as much as I should. I'm not praying the rosary as much as I should. I'm not doing my spiritual reading of the Summa every day as much as I should. And so sometimes people are very good-hearted and good-natured, trying to grow in their spiritual life, but they're getting this false sense of what it means to lead a Catholic spiritual life and lead a social and moral life. And so they will try to be like St. Teresa of Avila, but they kind of miss the fact that she was not married with 6 kids. She was a cloistered nun in a convent. And so sometimes people, I think, get this pressure on them that they should be praying a holy hour every day. And I don't know how realistic that is for someone with 6 kids and a job. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But when sometimes people bring up these shoulds, I like to try to ask, like, well, who told you should be doing all of these things every day? Unless that was Jesus, like, you got to evaluate that a little bit deeper if you're not able to care for the people in your life.
Yeah, I think the bigger shoulds are like, I should send my kids to Catholic school, or I should be a homeschooler, or I should, and some of that's like it's a big, I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting that there's actually a lot fewer shoulds than we act like it.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the schooling of your children is a big concern for
I think that's a big should, and I don't think it's a fake one. I think it's like I'm a completely public educated kid all the way through grad school, but like I wouldn't do that with my kid now. I might have done it if the schools were like it the way they weren't great when I went through them, but I'd be more prone to be okay with it back then, But anyway, all right. I don't know. I know that was a half-baked kind of like question to throw out, but I think people are struggling with that question without being able to say what it is. Like they're wondering why their life is not like it was when they grew up, why their neighbors are living differently than them, and they've inadvertently made a lot of these decisions, inadvertently meaning like they definitely deliberately made the decision to be good Catholics, but they didn't realize everything that came with it. Now it's surprising them a little bit, which is fine if they're really committed and good and finding the joy in everything. It's bad, but it becomes very hard on you if you're having a downtime, and it also is a big, I almost feel like I need to take a young person and be like, hey, this is what you're getting into, man. Mm-hmm. Like, don't believe everyone who says it's easy or something like this. Mm-hmm. Like, be realistic. This is what your future's going to look like, right? All right. How about we wrap this up? Thank you, Father Jimmy, very much for joining our podcast. On behalf of Laura, like, subscribe, and share this podcast with friends. Thank you, Father Jimmy, so much.
You're welcome. It was a joy, a pleasure to be here.
Peace.
Bye.
God bless.